sound quality. Our panelists will highlight what it's like to be working in San Francisco. They'll give you advice for seeking career opportunities in the Bay Area. Everyone is intentionally muted. There'll be time for questions at the end. If you have specific questions during the event, please feel free to add them to the Q&A box, and then we will address them at the end of this presentation. So right now, we're going to turn it over to our panelists, and I will ask some questions. I wanted to ask the panelists if you could start by sharing how GW, any organizations, any offices like career services, faculty, or any campus activities you participated in, how those played a role in your career development. And we'll start with Alex.
All right, I think I unmuted myself here. Hi, everyone. Great to see you all. And my name is Alex Cohen. I work in San Francisco. Currently, I'm working in product management for a company called Autodesk, which is architectural and construction and design software. So how I sort of got here, I was really involved in undergrad with this organization called WSTEM, with the engineering and math. And through that, every year that we would go to, and sometimes we would travel to it in Texas or other places. And when I was a junior in school, it was right after I had gotten back from being abroad. I went to this conference, and GW has a big presence there, and all of these other companies come and they actively recruit women in STEM fields. And so through that, I was kind of beelining it to be in the energy industry. And through various organizations and career services, so I ended up interviewing on the spot at this conference that was by the organization of GW, which is what gave me an internship and then got me a full job right after school. So that's my little path through an organization. I'd never been to the West Coast before this internship as well, so it was very, very much new terrain for me.
And Ashley, do you want to share with us?
Sure, absolutely. So, hi, my name is Ashley Wells. I'm a group manager at Adobe. I work in go-to-market strategy and operations. And my path here was quite circuitous, but I guess I can attribute some of it back to GW. I ended up getting plugged in, even though I was not in the business school. I was a poli-sci major, did tons of government and political internships, but I had started to get excited about the possibility of the private sector and partnerships with government, which led me to government consulting. And it was a contact through the business school that got me plugged in to the recruiting process for consulting. So I went to Deloitte after GW, spent 4 years there, got my MBA, and leveraged that experience working in large-scale environments within government to go consult with technology companies, also very large scale, also servicing huge groups of populations across the world in ways similar to the government, and ended up at Adobe about 2 years ago. So my role is around business operations, so all of setting our 1-year strategy and growth goals and working with a 600-plus person sales team to go execute a multi-billion-dollar number each year. So that was my path coming to Adobe.
And Patrick?
Yeah, so Patrick Zorno. I did my grad work at GW in public health and wrapped that up. I think it was 2015. It feels like a really, really long time ago, but I guess at this point, March feels like a long time ago. So I'm a director of alliance management at a health tech company called My Health Teams. So we develop social networks for people living with chronic diseases where they can come connect with each other to find social support, as well as resources on their specific condition and how to manage that, treatments, all types of different dimensions of that. I actually found this job through a recruiter. I was recruited for this role, but prior to this, I had been at a DC-based tech startup working on clinical trials for 4 years. And I actually found that opportunity through a former classmate. So be a good group work member. It can be super frustrating, but especially in grad school, treating your classmates as potential colleagues, I think demonstrates a real maturity and can get you a foot in the door in places. I had never worked in tech before, but through this classmate, I went to this startup. I helped them launch a new product line that led to our acquisition. And then we went through a merger after that. So kind of went through a very, very compressed life cycle of a startup in 4 years, startup, post-acquisition, post-merger. And that's part of why I was recruited for this role, because it's a much earlier stage startup where they are sort of integrating sales and stakeholder management roles. So that's kind of how I found this opportunity. And prior to that, I would say my first opportunity out of grad school, I found through a faculty member. And it's a place where I had actually done my practicum, and then they ended up hiring me full time.
Right. So the second question I want to ask is, share with the students, what the difference is between what they're used to in DC and what life corporate-wise and, on a personal level is like in the Bay Area. Alex?
Yeah, so I think I'm unmuted again. This is the hardest part of the panel. So the question is just how it's a little bit different. I mean, I think for me specifically, I think it's really challenging to find a job that directly aligns with what you study, and a job, even coming to San Francisco, the cities are different and similar in a lot of different ways. And so I think the question I asked myself too is, I knew I wanted to be in a city, and I knew I was just trying to get as much experience as I wanted to. And I think from my perspective, like a corporation was able to offer a lot of that opportunity. I was in a rotational program, which gave me exposure to a lot of different types of work that I could, think if this is something that was similar to my major or different. And at the time, it was I was trying to learn as much as I possibly could, just from even things that I did not want to do long term. And so I think that, new cities give you more opportunities that way, and that was really great. Was the question too, Steve, how DC was different than San Francisco?
What are the main differences you noticed between your 4 years in DC, maybe an internship you did in DC, and the corporate life in the Bay Area?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely different focuses. I think if you go to DC, and there's very much this political atmosphere and drive and energy that you feel, and sometimes whatever you do, any different types of fields kind of get anchored back to that. So I had an internship with the Red Cross, and it was engineering focused, but it still gets anchored back to these larger organizations, which is really great. I think in San Francisco, the difference is that there's more of a tech focus. And even if you don't work in tech, I think everything sort of gets filtered back to this overarching theme. And there's pros and cons to both of those, but I think it's sort of just the atmosphere and what everyone does around you obviously influences the culture in a lot of ways as well. I think the other thing, more on a personal note in San Francisco, is there's a lot of green space and outdoor activities, which are really wonderful. So it leaves a lot of room for having like a pretty full life outside of work, which I really enjoy.
Okay. Alex, you can share, or Ashley, if you could share with us, that would be great.
Well, I completely agree with Alex's point on life outdoors and how amazing it is. So that's lifestyle is a huge, huge part of living in California and the Bay Area. I would say, some commonalities of people on the West Coast are, it's also, San Francisco specifically is also a very young city, similar to how DC can be a very young city. Additionally, people are fairly politically plugged in. right? When I've lived in Philly or you've lived in other places, it's not necessarily the same. So if that's something you enjoy about DC, you can definitely find bits of that here as well. From a professional perspective, I would say there's definite differences between kind of the government heavy and kind of corporate heavy cultures of DC and the East Coast versus West Coast. So, you know, being out here, you meet a lot of people who didn't even graduate college, who were able to, you know, I think Patrick had some great examples of being in high growth companies, you know, many of which are led by young people who have done amazing things very quickly in their careers. So I think there's not that same kind of earn your way up through the ranks and kind of time spent in role culture that you can see on the East Coast that's out here. It also definitely skews more informal. So it's less about kind of certainly things like executive presence, right? And being able to, you know, communicate as a leader is still important no matter which company or coast you're on. But the level of formality with which you need to do that is different. So yeah, more relaxed vibe. And yeah, that's definitely a fit for me.
And Patrick?
Yeah, so just for context, I lived on the East Coast for 16 years, and I've been out here for like almost about 2.5 now. And I agree, life in California is amazing, especially the Bay Area. None of these plants in the background are mine, but I get to enjoy them every day anyway. So like, green spaces can literally be in your backyard. You know, I want to like sort of address the typical elephant in the room that I hear when talking about California, or specifically the Bay Area, and just like how expensive it is. I didn't really find a huge difference between DC and San Francisco in terms of like the ratio of what you earn to what you have to spend to live here. I think if you're willing to get creative and you don't need to live in a mansion in Pack Heights, then San Francisco is very doable. So for those of you who might be earlier on in your careers, it's definitely something to consider and budget out, but it's not impossible. I think just like culturally in the workplace, I agree with everything that the other panelists said, and I would add one thing that I really miss about the East Coast is the directness. I think that the communication out here can sometimes be a little higher context. So, you know, you get more of a lead in, it's less to the point, a little more indirect. So that's one of the things that I miss. But otherwise, I would say the point that I heard that resonated the most with me is that there's not this sort of stodgy traditional time and role mentality out here. And in fact, I would say the average tenure at a company in the Bay Area, like if you're somewhere for 2 years, people will see that and think, wow, that's a really long time. Whereas in DC, I think folks tend to stick around, especially in larger companies, for quite a bit longer than that.
Okay. So moving on to the next question, Alex, you know, considering that our students live, you know, while they're going to school on the East Coast, what advice would you have for them as far as how to search for a job in the Bay Area? Anything you can supply as to how you may have looked, or in other jobs since you've been there, how you've gone about it? Because with the idea that they're not anchored out there right now, how is it that they can look for opportunities?
Yeah, I think the best resource that I would recommend, and that I've sort of the jobs that I've had after school and through other internships, is kind of landed in your lap through LinkedIn. I think even if you're not really active on it or don't have a huge presence, I think it is a really amazing tool to just search by cities and search by job roles or types of jobs. And it also shows you connections, which I think is really valuable, where you can figure out if you know a friend of a friend or somebody similar. But they have this really, you know, it's up to date. You can get push notifications when new jobs that kind of meet your criteria are posted. And I just think it's a really amazing resource that you can create connections through it, but it's a really good starting point to specify the type of role and the location that you're looking for. And then you can find people that you can talk with or other contacts at that company from there. It's also, I mean, in my experience as well, like the first job I joined after my first job when I moved out here, I wasn't even looking for a job, but I think once you're sort of connected on there, they kind of find you. So it's a sort of two-way connection point that led me to a startup company that I joined afterwards. And I think that it's like, it gives you so many more opportunities than you think are available on this normal, you know, finding a company, because there are so many more companies and corporations that you can even think about that are on various different sizes that are all out here, which is also really cool. So yeah, LinkedIn is, I think, best
Ashley,
answer
go ahead.
for that.
Okay, Ashley, go ahead. If you could share some insight.
Yeah, plus one on Alex's insights around LinkedIn and how to use that as a good tool. I would say, you know, it's been a really hard year for hiring. I mean, I work at a company, it's a public company, we're fairly conservative, so we've been on a hiring freeze for 6 months that we're kind of just coming out of. So the good news about that for the folks on this call is, you know, we never stopped our recruiting pipeline from undergrad and from graduate schools. And so I would say, you know, definitely using the Career Center and job postings that are happening through GW is, or even looking on various tech companies you're interested in and figuring out how they kind of recruit from the pipeline, right, of current students is going to be really, really helpful, because where sometimes recruiting has dried up, right, with experienced candidates, we don't want to stop that talent pipeline coming straight from school. So take advantage of that and really use your experience kind of jumping off it from a student perspective to see where that can land you in companies, because that's often a different pipeline, right, that we run than experienced candidates.
Okay. And Patrick?
I'm just going to upvote the LinkedIn channel as well. If you're not on it, get on there. And one strategy for crafting your presence on that platform is find people who inspire you, find people who have the role that you want to. Many of them are really, really good at using that platform to tell a story, and a story that's compelling. So I'm not going to put myself in that echelon, but I'll say one thing that I put front and center when I'm talking to anybody about my career is why I want to do it, not just what I want to do. So I am in health because I'm super passionate. Grew up in a place where health education wasn't really a thing. I grew up in the Deep South and had my own personal experiences trying to navigate a health landscape and find support. So for me, like, it's just a no-brainer to go out and seek opportunities like that. So definitely use LinkedIn. And I would say, you know, if you meet somebody who excites you, talk to them. So one of the ways that I found, like my big opportunities in grad school was, you know, the first day of one of my classes, I went up and talked to the professor who just got me, all my nerd senses were like going crazy in this class. And I asked if, you know, we could grab a coffee, and we did. And she told me what she was working on and that she might have something for me in January if a grant comes through. And I said, well, what are you doing until January? You can't just be teaching and not working. So I actually ended up helping her write grants. And through that was exposed to a lot of other faculty members, people in the department. So again, like LinkedIn, talking to people you meet. These things seem really straightforward, but I would say just don't be shy. I think the worst somebody could say is no. You might get a lot of non-responses, but I think you will be pleasantly surprised at the number of people who are out there, especially if you share like an alumni connection with them who want to help you.
Okay, great. So staying on the career track, are there any tips you all can share not only about the networking, how they can address an original email to reach out to somebody. That's always the hardest part, because sometimes, like you said, Patrick, you're coming in and you recognize a connection, but how to get that person to respond to you or at least be interested in talking. So any tips you can share on that, as well as tips on what should be in your resume and in cover letters, would be great if you could share those.
Yeah.
I'll start with Alex.
Okay. I think the first thing to note is that, yes, we have a huge GW community in the Bay Area, but I think for the most part is that we're not a huge school that sends a lot of people out here right now. And I think if you were to say, you're a GW alumni, I think that in of itself goes a really long way, because you don't hear it that often. I think that that's a really easy message if you find someone who does work somewhere or something that you want to do. I think that's a really good lead-in. And I think Patrick mentioned this as well, just emphasizing the why in a sort of cold call email to somebody. Why do you want that? Why are you interested in that job, and why is that something that you would want to do? I also think that goes a long way. The other thing I would say in both resumes and just sort of blank emails would be keeping it short. I think in general, it's better to say a little bit of information that would make them want to talk to you and get more information from you than, pasting your resume in an email. I don't think that that's as useful as of your time, and just respectful of other people's time too. If you're asking somebody else for guidance or help, I think keeping it short and concise is usually better. Resumes, I would just defer to the career services group. I think that they know exactly what to do and how to organize it and what types of jobs are that you're looking for and how to structure it. So I would defer to you on all of those things.
Okay, thank you. Ashley?
Yeah, good advice on staying concise. Look, I think invest the time to reach out with a specific connection to why you're reaching out. I sometimes get a lot of generic outreach that's like, hey, I'm a student that's interested in accounting, and I saw that you worked at Deloitte, which is consulting, which is completely different, and I know nothing about accounting, and it's a massive 200,000 person company. So, be thoughtful when you reach out to people. The more specific you can be with, I'm interested in this company for XYZ reasons, or I see you had a similar role in business operations, and I've read about that, and that looks interesting to me, and I want to understand, what kind of things you do in your day-to-day. The more you can just be very intentional in why you're reaching out, as opposed to like broad strokes, mass blasting people, the more likely they are to respond. And frankly, the better use of your time as well, because you have more of an agenda and solid questions to go through. So that would be my advice.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Patrick?
Yeah, I'm gonna sound like a broken record again, but being really specific. And if you haven't had experience or taken any coursework or done any sort of like pitch writing, like somebody would do in PR or business development or whatever, it might be worth your time to like invest in an afternoon trying to learn the fundamentals of that skill set. So you don't ever want to bury your lead. So be really clear upfront about what it is you're looking for, like Alex and Ashley said. And I think, don't sell yourself short. Be clear about what you can offer. Like, what is it that you want to contribute? People get emails all the time with people asking for things from them. But I am always I'm far more likely to reply if somebody is like, oh, and here's something cool I'm working on that I want to take to a company. Like, I think I could make a difference. So just being really clear about your value. And when you do that on your resume, I would say quantify as much as you can. Results, results, results. I think in this especially if you're going to come out to San Francisco where there are like a bazillion companies that people may or may not have heard of. Like, if you work at Adobe, you probably don't need to explain what that is. But if you work at a small company, that's very niche in what they offer, underneath the company name, it might be worth just putting a sentence or two about what that company is so that a recruiter or hiring manager doesn't have to do that legwork themselves. But back to the results piece, whether it's outputs and you're talking about, I managed X many projects, or you're talking about like outcomes where you can talk about the revenue that you've helped drive, or, the number of new projects or new clients or whatever it is that you want to do. Just think about common ways that almost anybody could look at it and say, okay, that makes sense. That clicks in my brain. So when you're thinking about your results, think about results that sort of translate across companies and even across industries if you're looking to pivot to, a new space.
Great. So wrapping this up before we get to students' questions, if all of you could just kind of reflect on if somebody had given you, say, a couple of words of advice when you were an undergraduate, looking back on it now, what do you wish they would have told you, and what is it that you would have benefited the most from? Alex?
Wait, I have one more thing to add to your last question, too, before I get into my words of advice, which was Google News or other news sources are also a really easy way to find current information about a person or a company. So I encourage, it looks really good if you can reference what the team is working on or something that is really relevant. So, yeah, using that to your advantage is another good tip to have. Okay, but what advice would I want to give? I wish someone had told me right when I started undergrad and throughout it to befriend your advisor. I feel like sort of it was sort of always more of a, sign off papers relationship, and I've actually gotten really close with mine after school. But I think just having one person that can sort of, if you want to go to grad school, they can write you a letter of recommendation, or if you need a quick piece of advice that they'll remember you. Just having one person within your major or within your community that you can always have through school and then afterwards, I think is really, really valuable, and sort of cling on to that relationship and stay in touch with that person.
Right. And Ashley?
I would say it's a bit more personal in nature, but before you leave GW, especially if you have, it's really relevant for anybody, but especially if you have student loans, like really invest the time to be smart on all the terms and conditions of your loans, the repayment schedule, getting smart on how to save, like really good advice around starting your 401k day one, right? Of when you get into your first job. And like money management, they don't teach you in college, and it's super real, the second you leave college. So I would definitely try whatever you can to become personally financially savvy. And yeah, I mean, the other thing is just, it doesn't have to be GW, but whatever are the connections that you keep, kind of, building off of Alex's point is, just keeping your network up to date, not just with friends, but from a professional level. So, I founded a nonprofit when I was living in DC to network with other, women in business professionals, whatever that is for you, to kind of keep your network current and be constantly meeting new people. I think college is this breeding ground where you meet new people every day. And when you're in real life, it's much harder to do. And you have to be more intentional about how you do that and how you build your network. So invest the time in that in a way that you enjoy and can also, support your growth.
Right. Thank you. And Patrick?
This is a tough one because it's been a while since I was in undergrad. But I think if I, if I think about like what I wish somebody had told me, I would say probably don't compare yourself to other people. Your career is your own, and this might be just a good rule of thumb for life in general. It took me a long time to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. I waited 8 years before going back to grad school. And, during that time, there was a recession. I lost everything, had to start over kind of from the bottom up. And I saw other people who weren't going through that. And I got, really down on myself and probably missed some opportunities, sold myself a little short on what I had to offer and what I could do as a result. At the same time, I've seen, folks come into organizations that I've worked in over the past couple of years straight out of college, and, they're sort of comparing themselves to what their friends are doing. A really specific example was somebody who worked for me at a lean startup where we were like 40 people, was sort of comparing their day-to-day to somebody at a giant consulting firm, even in terms of salary. And, don't play that short game. Because it's unimportant, and just try and see like a balanced approach or a balanced picture of what you're doing. So maybe you're making less money today, but what's that long-term potential? Like if you contribute to the sale of a company, you could potentially cash out and make some real dollars and have like a nest egg to go do something you're more passionate about. Like I think one of the other panelists said it earlier, in those smaller companies here in the Bay Area, there's just so much more opportunity to advance rapidly. So if you're not where you want to be today, make a plan on how to get there and just execute on that plan. And if it's not working, then go somewhere else. Maybe another environment is better for you. But yeah, I think it's just better for your overall well-being and better for your career in the long run if you stay focused on what you're doing and don't draw parallel lines to your classmates.
Right. Thank you all. That was great advice. Do we have any questions from students for the panelists?
We do have a question. What were some of the biggest challenges you faced when looking for opportunities in the Bay Area?
I'm happy to jump in because mine is very top of mind for me. So I wanted to leave DC probably about 2 years before I actually did. And I was applying to jobs out here in San Francisco, but I didn't have tech experience. And that was a real barrier for me trying to get into the companies that I wanted to get into out here, because I think Alex said it, even if it's not tech specific, it kind of all roads lead back to that in this area a little bit. So that was a huge challenge, but the way that I overcame it was I went to an East Coast based startup and, just did anything and everything that I could to get that experience, including working like 70, 80-hour weeks for like 4 years, just to have that on my resume.
Let's see. I think, to be honest, I totally hear the point, Patrick, that you're bringing up about kind of just breaking in, right? Like it's the breaking in part that I think is a little bit tough, and getting that initial tech or startup or fill in the blank experience. But once you have that and you have that kind of credibility on your resume, honestly, this is the hottest talent market in the world. I think, Patrick, you said this earlier, that people don't stay at companies all that long. And so there is, with the exception of the COVID environment, and things are being, pretty exceptional right now, this is the hottest talent market in the world. And so you're going to have so many good options, really, like once you break in, it's just a matter of narrowing down into what you want to do, and the right kind of culture fit, company size, et cetera.
Yeah, I think Ashley and Patrick said it very well. The other thing, I guess on the other side, on a sort of different topic for how it was challenging for me is I knew I was moving out here in September, my senior year, which is a little bit obscure, but I think my challenge was finding affordable housing where in a neighborhood that I didn't know the area, didn't know what I was doing. And so my first year, I spent so much money on housing because I had heard, San Francisco is so expensive and there's such high cost of living. And so I settled for a place because I thought that's what you had to do. And I was signing a lease without seeing the apartment. But what I would encourage you to do is, like I think Patrick mentioned this earlier, is it's really not as obscurely different as East Coast cities. So do your research. It's a really good time to move and look at housing, and don't just take the first thing that you see when it comes to actually moving. You don't need a car. You can have one if you need to, but all of these things are not required as you may hear that they are.
So we have another question, and it is sort of tied to finance. I am between jobs and reconsidering San Francisco, maybe for a few months. Do you think this is enough time to get a proper feel of the city? Cost is my major concern.
So should they relocate to San Francisco right now, you mean?
Right. Do you feel like a few months is enough to get a feel for like life in San Francisco?
Got it. So I'll tell you, this is a really weird time, I think, to move to any major city, New York or San Francisco. I will say from a personal perspective, the rents have never been lower in San Francisco. So from that sense, it could be a good time. It's also kind of a bit of a shell of itself right now than what it normally is. So I'm not sure you'll get a proper feel. I would say that about almost any city probably in the U.S. right now. The other thing to consider is that being here physically doesn't really help you from a recruiting perspective. So I'm talking to candidates right now, all across the country, and we have very flexible terms. My company is not requiring us to be in the office until next July. So that's 9 months from now. So point being, I would say it's more of a personal choice. Coming to the city now is, you would get some portion of a feel, but if you would rather kind of save money elsewhere and still recruit for Bay Area jobs, they will be very flexible for you to live wherever you need to live until you start, which could be 9 months from now.
Anyone else have anything to add, or? Okay.
I think Ashley nailed it. Nowhere is normal right now.
Right.
But maybe just to provide some contrast, some of the things that you could get a feel for. Public transportation is still running about at the same capacity that it normally does, which is not great. It's really bad compared to the East Coast. I lived in Boston, New York, and DC, and out here, it's just not quite to the level of usefulness in terms of places that it actually branches out and goes. So you get a good feel for what it's like to commute, maybe not to an office, but to commute in general. I walk just about everywhere. You could get a feel for the outdoors. Unfortunately, a lot of stuff is closing, so you're not going to get, I would say San Francisco is a really food-centric city. There's so much good food at any price point here that you're just not going to have the same level of access to now. But you could still enjoy a lot of the outdoor stuff that was mentioned earlier, which is a huge part of life here. And what Ashley said about the rents is 1,000% true. You can probably even negotiate it down a couple $100 a month from what landlords are asking. And the other thing there is if you're concerned about moving here and getting locked in, it's probably not the most kosher thing to say, but San Francisco is the most tenant-friendly city, I think, probably in the world. You have so many rights here. If there's any sort of dispute, I would say the law almost always sides with the tenant. So if you wanted a trial period, I think you could come out here and be really upfront with anybody in a housing situation and be just fine about doing that, and you wouldn't get stuck.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up here because we had, set a 45-minute time limit. Again, a huge thank you to our panelists for donating their time to be part of this. Additionally, if you'd like to connect with alumni for career advice related to the Bay Area or any other region, check out GW Career Connect. We currently have over 60 people in San Francisco itself, and there's over 138 overall who have volunteered to give career advice, much like what you've gotten today. And they were more than happy. I believe Rachel has dropped the link into the chat. So again, I want to thank everybody for being part of it. Alex, Ashley, Patrick, thank you for always being the last one. I didn't mean to put it that way, but then halfway through I realized, I kind of put him on the spot of always having to come up with something. But I appreciate all of you being part of this. Thank you so much. And I think that's all we have.
Thank you. Bye.